Chapter 13 of 1 Corinthians. This is a short chapter, 13 verses, but I think that if we were to analyze what Paul has said here to any degree, we could probably spend months on it, because Paul illustrates to us the nature of love itself and how the attributes of love can be just overwhelming. And we're probably going to look at what Parkwriter put in his book, because as I looked at his lesson, I said there's nothing I could really improve on with what he said here, because he says quite a bit. And like I said, he could probably say a lot more, but you know, the time being what it is. But 1 Corinthians chapter 13 is interesting how he places it between chapter 12 and chapter 14. As we saw in chapter 12, he begins his discussion on spiritual gifts and how they are diverse and how they, compared to the body being diverse, yet diversity makes them one individual. And that's how the church itself is composed. And when he doesn't really get into it too much in chapter 12, but I think chapter 13 stands out, showing us that these 12 gifts were very divisive within the congregation at Corinth. They had become a point of contention, and I guess they were beginning to have factions over whose gift was better than the other. And so Paul puts this in here to illustrate that these gifts are temporary. They're going to pass away one day, or they'll be gone. And what is left is that which you need to hold on to. And then he goes into the regulation of these gifts in chapter 14. So when we look at chapter 1, he begins teaching about chapter 13. Back in chapter 12, he begins teaching about these spiritual gifts. As we know, they became envious of those who possessed the best gifts, and they even considered which of these gifts were more valuable than the others as far as the possession goes. And I think even those we see in the charismatic groups today, they tend to place importance on other gifts as being more important than others even today. Now, Paul teaches that all Christians are equally important in the body of Christ. We saw that over in chapter 12, verses 12 through 27. The gift given by the Holy Spirit, that was needful for that person to do the work of God. And not only that, but the collective group itself profited by this individual gift, as we saw back in chapter 12, and I think about verse 7 or 8. So the whole group profited by these gifts that were given to the individuals. So some preliminary thoughts that I kind of wanted to go over about this before we get into this particular chapter. The first thing is that Paul taught that love is the greatest gift that a person can have. We'll see that in the chapter. He also, we understand that Paul exhibited a certain amount of indignation towards the Corinthians and some of the things in which they were doing. As we saw back in chapter 3, their lack of spiritual growth, he chastised them for it. Their tolerance of fornication, chapter 5, chastised them for it. Taking each other to secular courts to resolve problems, again, he chastised them for it. And then the abuse of the Lord's Supper. In fact, he gets very indigent towards them about what they were doing, and you see the anger in his voice and what they were doing with the Lord's Supper. So when we look at this phrase love, we have to understand, what is Paul doing with these Corinthians when he's chastising them to try to correct them? It's kind of like a parent's love for a child. If you don't love your child enough, you're not going to correct them. So if you love a child, you will ensure that they will be corrected, and that they will go through life understanding the importance of being the type of person that Christ wants us to be. So Paul exhibited these types of chastisements, but it was in the act of love. Now, we might refer sometimes to that as righteous indignation. Christ exhibited this in Matthew chapter 21, verses 12 through 13, when he overturned the money changer's table and drove him out of the temple. He was angry. He took care of the situation, and it was a teaching lesson for him. It was kind of more aggressive than what Paul was doing with the Corinthians. His verbal thing, Christ went physical with it. And we must be careful. You know, sometimes righteous indignation may be acceptable. I don't think it is. You know, I don't think we need to go there with that. But those that have in their mind that it's okay to have righteous indignation in extreme points, they sometimes think that it sometimes goes into the area of becoming self-righteous in their indignation. And I've seen that among, occasionally, once or twice, let me back up, amongst God's people, where they think that they're right, and if you don't agree to what they believe in or accept or teach, then you are wrong and you need to be corrected or withdrawn from. And that, to me, is self-righteous indignation, and we need to try to stay away from that. Now, why is this chapter so forceful? Well, let's consider Paul's conduct before he became a Christian. As we know in Acts chapter 1, when Stephen was being stoned to death, we see that Saul was consenting to his death. Acts chapter 8, verse 3, it says, "As for Saul, he made havoc of the church, entering every house, dragging off men and women, and committing them to prison." Acts chapter 9, verses 1 through 3, "Then Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked for letters from him to the synagogues of Damascus, so that if he found any who were of the way, whether men or women, he may bring them bound to Jerusalem." Does that indicate a person that has love? In a way it does. He had love for the law of Moses, and he looked at Christianity as being destructive to that law. And he did not understand the gospel itself. So Paul was acting out of love to God, but a misdirected type of love. But it was very physical, and he had a mental attitude that the law and its dictates is what we need to follow by. Everything else, even if it becomes binding people and throwing them in prison and committing them to death according to the law of Moses, was acceptable. Paul had a mindset that had to really go 180 3 or 4 times to get his head straight. But as we see in chapter 13, and considering his prior conduct, Paul understood what law was about. Now, after his conversion, we see this in Acts chapter 15, verses 35 through 40. "Then after some days, Paul said to Barnabas, 'Now let us go back and visit our brethren in every city, where we have preached the word of God, and see how they are doing.' Now Barnabas was determined to take with him John, called Mark, but Paul insisted that they should not take with them the one who had departed from them in Pamphylia, and had not gone with them into the work. Then the contention became so sharp that they parted from one another. And so Barnabas took Mark and sailed to Cyprus, and Paul chose Silas and departed, being commended by the brethren to the grace of God, and he went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches." You see what happened here? They got in an argument about who was going to accompany them on this journey. It got so contentious that they had to part ways, one went this way and one went that way. Paul still had a little problem with what he needed to consider as far as the act of love and what needed to be done.
I want to say, I think people think that why did God chose Paul because he was so against the church. But I think the reason he chose Paul is because when Paul committed himself to Christianity or to the law of Moses, he went all out. He went for it all out. And I think that's why God chose him, because when he saw Jesus and believed Jesus and confessed him and he was baptized, and he knew that he was wrong. And when he went over to Christianity, he went all out. And God knew that.
His dedication and commitment to the law of Moses, if he believed in Christ, became a gospel preacher or a Christian, he knew that that type of love and dedication he carried forth in delivering the gospel. You're correct on that. So, this particular chapter's got 4 or 5 points. First 3 verses, he says, "There's no profit in what we do without love. Then love suffers long and is kind. Love never fails. And the gospel brings us from childhood to maturity. And love is the greatest gift we have. Now, love is a vital principle without which all else is vain. Without love, everything else is useless, is worthless. This chapter, as Harpwriter says, is the most beautiful and tender illustration of the nature and excellency of the power of love. Love is above the power of speaking languages of both men and angels. You know, but people will say today that believe in this charismatic gift speaking, that this gibberish that they're talking is not a language that man understands, but it's a language of angels. Paul is not saying that. What he's saying in this particular verse is, though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels and have not love, I'll become a sounding brass. Whatever it may be that I'm saying, or what language I'm speaking in, if I'm not doing this with love, then it's useless. So he's using that as an analogy, not as saying that there is a tongue of angels that we speak this to God and only God understands it. And that's what people claim today. That tends to be their out in this particular situation, because they themselves cannot speak the tongues of men that they do not understand. Now, without love and sympathy and kindness, it's worthless. So the characteristics of love, the agape type love that Paul has given to us is, I don't think I've got that on the slide. I think I've got it in my notes. Let me find it. It's a love, as Thayer says, is a love of Christians towards Christians, which is enjoined and prompted by their religion, whether the love be viewed as in the soul or as expressed. Strong's expresses it pretty good. He says agape is a term used in the New Testament to describe the selfless, sacrificial, and unconditional love. It is the highest form of love, often associated with the love of God for humanity and the love that believers are called to have for one another. It's the kind of love that we see in John chapter 3:16, that God loved the world so much that he sent his son to die for us. We should have the same type of love towards God and towards each other. And that is, I think, a very good definition of how this particular love is to be expressed. Now, the characteristics. There's, I forgot how many, about 9 here. Love suffers long, it is kind, it envies not, it parades not itself, it is not arrogant, it does not behave rudely or unbecomingly, it does not seek its own, it is not provoked, love thinks no evil, does not rejoice in iniquity, love rejoices in truth, bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, and endures all things. So when we see the first one, excuse me, that love suffers long, love manifests itself as being patient, slow to anger, not quick to retaliate when it's wrong. It does not encourage or uphold a man in sin. Instead, it helps him out of that sin. And consequently, one who believes, one who loves will kindly correct the disorderly, encourage the faint-hearted, and support the weak. It's long-suffering. Pretty much the same type of attitude that God has towards man, we should have towards each other. We should be patient, not quick to retaliate. We should encourage or uphold the man in sin to help him out of it, and love him enough to correct his disorderly ways, and encourage him when he's weak. Love is kind. Love will actively do good to another rather than rendering evil for evil. It's kind of like do unto others before they do unto you. Well, Christ taught us that we should do unto others as we would have others do unto us. If we want to have peace in life, then we should give that type of love towards each other. It is gentle and not harsh, sour, or have a gloomy disposition or ill nature. One who loves and even prays for his enemies is ready to forgive. And that's a hard thing to do, is to pray for our enemy and hope that they will forgive us even as we forgive them. It does not envy. Envy tends to resent others and criticize them when they excel. That's sometimes, when you think about it, envy can be a sneaky thing in a person's life. When someone excels in something or becomes profitable or something good happens in their life and you're thinking, well, that doesn't happen to me. You become envious of them, and sometimes you start having an animosity towards them in the way that they have been successful or the way they have conducted their lives to the point where you consider them better than yourself. Love acts differently by wishing the best for others and rejoicing when they do well. You know, that's the way we should feel. When people do good, we should be right there with them. Love does not parade itself. And when it says parade, we're looking at the idea that parade means to brag or to boast or to vaunt oneself. In other words, we should not become arrogant or prideful, kind of like the king of Babylon says, look at what I have done. All of this is, because of me. That's not the attitude that we should have. Instead, love is humble, is retiring, and feels no need to wave flags when good works are done. We should not be like that person that stands on the street corner blowing his trumpet saying, look at me and my great prayer that I've given to God. Any attributes, any ability as a gift endowed from God that should be received with gratitude and used without boasting. And that's one of the things that the Corinthians had a problem with, is they liked to boast in what their abilities were. And when a person had, let's say, the gift of tongues or the gift of healings, they could have said, I'm doing some great things here. And so look what I can do. I can heal this individual that's on his deathbed. And just like that, he becomes well. And he can become boastful of it, and because of that, other people will look at it and become envious and become hateful for his abilities. Love is not arrogant or puffed up. Love is not proud or arrogant, does not elevate itself over others and as regarded as inferior. It does not behave rudely or becomingly. Instead, he is courteous, polite, mannerly, and will behave with gentleness, sympathy, and will be considerate and have a lot of consideration for the feelings of others. We should not become rudely or unbearing or unbecoming in our type of love towards others. We should be courteous and we should be polite and mannerly. It does not seek its own. A charitable person is unselfish in every way, esteeming others better than himself by seeking their good above his own good. And that, I think, is important. We always want to have good within our own lives. We want to be happy. We want to be content. We want everything to be perfect. And we should have that same love towards other people. We should not seek it for ourselves, but if we're profitable, happy, we should bestow this upon other people. His own rights are not the main focus of this attention. If we look at that as being self-seeking, then we become guilty of not loving our own brother. It is not provoked. This is an individual that's not easily irritated and stirred to anger. It possesses an even temper that will not allow the evils of others to provoke him to react with vile words and harsh actions. It is calm, good-natured, and in control of his passions. And he will not let the sun go down on his wrath. That's a hard one sometimes, when we think about it. To be not easily provoked, we have to be totally in control of our emotions and ourselves. We have to know that when a person becomes aggressive against us verbally, we do not want to let our own angers flare up. We want to try to remain calm, even-tempered, and just approach these things in a logical manner. Just don't overreact, as some people say. So we should not fall into the trap of what they're doing. If they're in anger towards us, we should not fall into the trap of becoming angry right back at them. And if there is a disconnect, or if there's some kind of contention between us, we should not let our sun go down on our wrath. We need to get it resolved as soon as we can. If we don't, then it will consume us like a cancer. Love thinks no evil. Love does not take into the account of wrong suffered. It keeps no records of wrong. That's another difficult one. When a person's wronged us, it's easy for us to remember that wrong that person did, and we should never allow that to happen. Now, we should be on guard with those that have wronged us and refuse to correct themselves. You know, if they've done it once, they're probably gonna do it again. But being on guard is not the same thing as not keeping a record of it. You know, if someone has wronged us, and if they're not willing to correct that wrong, then we should not hold that wrong against them. We understand this is the nature of the individual. If they will not correct themselves, then so be it. But I will not let that wrong done to me fester on me for the rest of my life. It can be just as destructive as anything else. We should, we should just let it go. But at the same time, these people, we need to be aware of their attitudes and their actions. It tends to look kindly on the actions of others, possibly to have mistaken a conduct. You know, Paul did not feast on the gossip that he may have heard. I think that might be in the next one. He thinks, no, he does not feast on, he looks kindly on the actions of others, possibly to have mistaken his conduct. You remember back over in chapter 12, and I think it's chapter 11, verse 18, he says, first of all, when you came together as a church, I hear that there are divisions among you, and I partly believe it. He heard these rumors, but he did not take it hook, line, and sinker as being true. He said, I partly believed it, but I wanted to find out for sure. He investigated further about this conduct. So he does not jump easily thinking evils of others because of something he heard. Does not feast on gossip, nor does he retell it to others. One does not jump to the worst conclusion when he hears something about another, instead desiring to find a good and reasonable explanation. So, sometimes we hear things that are passed on as gossip or just idle chat. Don't think the worst of other people simply because you hear something bad about them. Make sure of yourself, make sure of all things, as Paul says, and hold fast to that which is good in relation to the gospel. Does not rejoice in iniquity. Love does not delight in the evil and rejoice in unrighteousness. When others do fall into sin, it finds no occasion of happiness in it, but will work to help the brother to correct his sin. James chapter 5. Does not find pleasure in a malicious report. It does not actively remember the wrongs committed that another has committed. You know, I'll tell you this little story about acting with pleasure in a malicious report. Don't have time for that. But it illustrates a point. It illustrated a point that a person's anger and hatred for another can drive them to the point that he rejoices in the fact that this guy was facing possible death. And when he survived, they were just as angry because he lived. And I'm talking about workers, co-workers, and a manager. And the whole time I was looking at this, I said, I can't believe these people's attitude that they would wish that this guy would die. But they found pleasure in a report, and they relished it. But when it didn't happen, they became even more angry in a good report anyway. Love rejoices when others do well. You know, when a person succeeds in something or becomes better at what he does, we should be right there with them and be happy for him. It will not make hasty judgment. That will be may be inaccurate. It will be careful to hear all the facts and the desire to find the truth. It rejoices when suspicions are proved unfounded, when wrong is vanquished and right prevails. We rejoice in truth. When I hear things that are not true, I don't rejoice in that fact, because now it shows me that I have things that I have to try to find out. And when I find out what the truth is, then it kind of goes back to the individual that may have said something to me, and now I've got, I rejoice in the truth, and I don't relish those things that are not true, because now it becomes a burden upon me to find what the truth is. God doesn't like liars, and he says all liars will go to the lake of fire. And the same thing with me. If a person lies to me about something, I don't like that. And I have to understand what the truth is. When I find out what the truth is and find out this individual's a liar, then here we go. We've got more issues to deal with. But whatever the truth is, and when we find out what truth is, when others do well, and when we hear reports of things being done well, we should rejoice in that truth. Love bears all things. Love is not quick to censor anything or find fault, but deal with an attitude that always protects. We should not look for fault in others. You know, sometimes we are guilty of that, and whether it be to an excess or even, you know, small little things that annoy us, we should not let these things become a way of finding a fault in an individual that we downgrade him, but rather we should bear all things in the love that we should have. Whatever patience, with patience, it will strive to help another out of error. If we find an individual in error, we will with love try to bring them out. It's kind of like Paul in his admonition towards the Christians when he rebuked them for their divisions, he rebuked them for their tolerance of fornication, for their problems with legal issues. He was using these, his manner of teaching as an apostle and the authority that Christ has given him to strive to help them out of their error. So he got a little, you know, more like a father to them than, you know, as an equal, you know, brother to brother. But he had the patience to bear all things and to try to help each other out. Love covers a multitude of sins. When it helps to share another, the load that another is carrying. Now, we do cover a multitude of sins, but an individual that may have a burden in life, let's say we have an individual that has problems, addictions of some type that we know is wrong. If we can help this individual carry his load, pull him through these problems till we get him on the other side, then we have helped him overcome sin and we've helped him become a better Christian for it. We bear all things. We help them with that. We strive it with patience, and we are quick to censor. We're not quick to censor another or find his fault in that attitude. Love believes all things. Of all these we believe, we tend to believe the best. We trust them that will act with the best motives. Therefore, we will not judge or condemn them with partial evidence. We will treat them as we would want to be treated. Love believes all things. Going back to 1 Corinthians 11, verse 18, Paul says, I partly believed it. You know, I heard something, but I'm not sure until I find out what it's all about. Love hopes all things. No matter how dark things may look, love will not despair. Even when the circumstances are unfavorable, love hopes for the best and will lift up those who are discouraged. And it endures all things. No matter what blemishes or mistakes another makes, true love will help keep on loving. A mother who loves her child will endure loss, even the death of her the child. She will even stand up to the point where she will die for her child to endure, to ensure his safety. Likewise, one who loves will continue an affection for another even when things are not going well. So, you know, when you look at this list and all the things that the Harp Writer brings out in it, like I said, we could spend, you know, days talking about all of this and making analogies and putting things together. But I look at this list and I look at Paul's life and what Christ has taught him and how he changed his life to mold the acts of love. It's amazing the effect that it had upon his life. Now, a love will abide when spiritual gifts will cease. He says that in 8 through 13, he says, love never fails, but where there are prophecies, they will fail. Whether there are tongues, they will cease. Whether there is knowledge, it will vanish away. Now, when we look at this particular verse, we see Paul beginning to say these gifts, these partial gifts that he talks about in chapter 12, that makes up the whole, or provides the ability for the whole to function correctly, will indeed pass away. He mentions 3 gifts, but it's kind of a representation of the whole group that he has over in chapter 12. Now, I tend to look at the this list. And as he points out, 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verse 22, as we'll see, that tongues were a sign for unbelievers. They'll no longer be needed because the unbelievers will have the gospel for their sign. Even this says they have the prophets of the Old Testament to prove that Christ is the Son of God. Here are the prophets. Miraculous gifts, knowledges, all of these would vanish away. And all of this would happen when the New Testament was firmly confirmed. Now, he says these three gifts stand as representation of the whole spiritual gifts. But I think it's interesting that Paul enumerates these particular three, because I tend to think that maybe the Corinthians had elevated these three up to the point of importance in their list of A, B, C, D, E, F, G. I'd rather have A than G. And of these three gifts, the gifts of tongues, the gifts of knowledge that was miraculously given unto him, and the gift of prophecy. These three, I think they were, very important to him. But he says all of these would be done away with when that which is perfect is come. Now he says, verse 9, for we know in part and we prophesy in part. Now in part, as we said, that Paul was comparing the various gifts to the various parts of the body as they make up the whole. They function differently, but the whole body was complete because of it. And because they were different, the body was complete, it was edified because of it. Each spiritual gift was a part because no one person had all of God's revelation. Each spiritual gift worked to make the church whole before the complete gospel was revealed. That was what was in part. Now, Paul says that which is perfect is come, then that which is in part shall be done away. Again, he's talking about in part. Parts of the spiritual gifts. He said all these are going to be done away when that which is perfect is come. Now, the 9 spiritual gifts were the parts. They were transferred to the believers by the laying on of the apostles' hands, as we see over in Acts chapter 8, verses 14 through 25. Now, when the apostles died, the ability to pass these gifts on to others ceased. And those that had received these gifts, whenever they lived out their lives, were not able to pass it on to other people, so at that particular time they ceased. Now, the word perfect stands for completed revelation, which cannot be changed without sin. James chapter 1, verses 25, he says, but he who looks into the perfect law of liberty and continues therein. Now, the perfect law of liberty is what I think Paul is speaking of here. Because when we have the perfect law, the perfect gospel of Christ, we have a completed revelation, we have the completed mind of Christ. And Paul says, this is what man needs to look into. We do not need to look for these things that help us there. As a child, I believed as a child, and I spoke as a child, and understood as a child. I was immature. But now as I grew up and I have knowledge of all things, I don't need these childish things to help me through my life. We do not need to continue to act as a child. Now, I think this is kind of interesting. He says knowledge is limited only to the part that was revealed. The entire revelation can be held in our hands. We can see it clearly. We have the mind of Christ. Now, Paul says, now I know in part. He's looks into a mirror darkly. He says, I can see a vague resemblance, but there's going to be a time when it's going to be very clear. I can see every hair on my mustache, if he's had one. But he says something I think very interesting, and when I looked at all my commentaries, nobody actually really touched on this. He says, now I know in part, in verse 12, but then I shall know, just as I am known. What is Paul saying here? He's saying, I know in part. I don't know the complete gospel up until this time. But then I shall know. There will be a time when it shall be revealed to me, the whole thing. And then I will know the whole mind of Christ, just as people around in this world knows who I am. Now, consider this. 1 Corinthians was written around 57 AD. They say that James, when he made that statement, the perfect law of liberty, was written about 60 AD. Paul died about 66 AD. So within 3 or 4 years, Paul had the complete mind of Christ, and he knew all things before he died. So the whole mind of Christ was revealed to him. And he said, then I shall know, even as I am known. Now you can go anywhere in America and you can ask the question, do you know who Billy Graham is? Everybody knows Billy Graham. They know who he is. That's when he's saying, I will know everything just as I am known within the churches of our Lord. Now abideth faith, hope, and love. These 3 attributes existed then and will remain even as the spiritual gifts cease. As he says, the greatest of these is love. Now, why does he say the greatest of these is love? Well, he's saying the same thing that Christ said. Matthew chapter 22, he says, Jesus said unto them, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and the great commandment. The second is like unto it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these 2 commandments hang all the law and the prophets. Love. That's why Paul was trying to teach these people, your divisive, antagonistic, factious ways have no place in the house of God. Because love is what the whole gospel of Christ hangs upon. And if you don't have it, then you don't have the gospel. And he's trying to teach them by all these attributes. If you can understand and go back and just massage all of these attributes and apply them to your life, then you will make one step closer to understanding the true love of God. Now, in conclusion, we should not allow problems to override a sound mind. We should not allow things to rile us up. Concern for others, coupled with love, can resolve problems. You know, I heard something years ago when I was a child, and it just stuck with me. It said, yesterday's trouble is today's understanding, rewoven into tomorrow's love. So problems we may have had in the past, we can come to an understanding, and then we can understand the love that we have for each other. Righteous indignation should always be the very last resort, if ever. And I would encourage everybody never to resort to righteous indignation. Problems can be resolved without being angry about the situation. Even though a person may be angry, you do not retaliate in the same manner. Jesus had the right to do it because he was the Son of God. And I think Paul exercised it to an extent because he was acting as the ambassador of Christ. We as Christians, we should be very, very careful when it comes to righteous indignation. We have been given the gift of God's love. We should give that gift to others. Worship God always, edify the brethren, and demonstrate our love for both. Didn't think I was going to get through it all. Any comments? Didn't leave you any time, did I? So if you have any comments, let me know, and we'll get them addressed next class. But anyway, chapter 13, short chapter, but it is packed with a wealth of information. You just sit down and try to understand it and study.